as you said, I'm actually quite in favor of economic growth, and you probably know that I had debates there with people for degrowers. I will not going to repeat them all now, but I believe that economic growth is absolutely indispensable for the improvement in not only way of life of people, but actually allowing people opportunities to basically self-realize. Without economic growth and without income and without wealth, you really cannot self-realize because you're so much constrained in your daily activity. You just go, it's practically survival. From day to day, you have to fight to survive. And what income gives us is a possibility to go a little bit beyond that and really realize our human potential.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. This is Alex Hochuli here in São Paulo, Brazil. We've also got Philip Cunliffe in London, and George Hoare is away this week. But in his place, very delighted to announce that we have Branko Milanovic, who will be speaking to his professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Branko's a renowned Serbian-American economist whose area of expertise is inequality, and who's known for his contributions to public debate on the question of inequality as well as many other areas. He's widely published on questions of political economy, including most recently Capitalism Alone, which we will be discussing as we go through, as well as talking a little bit towards the end about Branko's new work, which we're very eager to hear about. This is something which I've been wanting to have, a discussion we've been wanting to have for a very long time. So we're delighted to have you, Branko. Hello.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much, Philip. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes.
So excellent. Welcome to the show, Branko. And before we talk about your most recent work, we wanted to discuss your background a little. And by way of introduction, I don't know if you came across this blog, but I thought I would put it to you because I was quite struck by it. So a Serbian blogger called Serbian-American, he mentioned that in Cold War era Yugoslavia, where you were raised and educated, it was perched in a unique position between East and West, and this generated a very distinctive type of public figure and intellectual, which only really a socialist European country that wasn't part of either bloc could really produce. And in this blog post, he mentioned Garčević, that is, he mentioned yourself, as well as figures such as the artist Marina Abramović and the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek as these kind of iconoclastic and intellectually independent figures that could only have come out of a country like the ex-Yugoslavia. So I wanted to start by asking how important do you think your Yugoslav origins are to your outlook and work, if at all?
Great, actually, to start with that question. I like it very much. Let me say, I read actually what Srđan wrote, and I even had thoughts of the very similar kind before. But one has to be a little bit careful because it is a little bit self-serving to claim that you had the unique opportunity that other people did not. However, I think there is some truth to that. I think that there is some truth because Yugoslavia, as you said, was out of the blocks, was non-aligned, and had a fairly critical view about the Soviet Union and Stalinism, actually anti-Stalinist country. Anti-Stalinist ideology was inbuilt into the Communist Party's approach, because, of course, they claimed with self-management, labor management, that they were very different than the Soviet type of socialism. On the other hand, there was a critical attitude towards the West. And I noticed that difference, especially with people of my age, because, many younger people obviously don't have that background because the situation changed in the last 30 years. But with people of my age, I do notice that, especially when I look at other East European of my age, who are sort of a knee-jerk anti-Soviet and then anti-Russian today, and very often unquestionably admiring the West. And on the other hand, also some people from, Western Europe or maybe the United States who actually agree with them, but also it may be without knowing much about the past, or maybe even actually many people have no idea even what the non-alignment was. So I would agree. Actually, I would say I would generally tend to agree, but I have to be a little bit careful because it does sound a little bit like a self-serving.
No, fair enough. And so you ended up working for the World Bank, including in Eastern Europe, and becoming an American citizen. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about how these changes affected your career and also your outlook.
I came to the World Bank in the early 80s, and I came in a most sort of prosaic way, in the sense just applying to work. They had advertisements. I remember that advertisement. Actually, my mother pointed this out to me. Yeah, they had advertisements in the Economist, and I think actually I was again privileged because of my background, because the competition to get into the World Bank was then very tough, and it's still extremely tough. As you know, it's a job that is relatively prestigious and is quite well paid, and you travel to many countries. But they had very few people from Eastern Europe, because in those days, only a couple of countries were, well, actually 4 countries, Yugoslavia, to the extent that it is Eastern Europe, Poland, Romania, and Hungary were members. And you could not actually get a job unless your country was a member. So obviously the supply from Eastern Europe was very weak. And in Romania, actually, you could not even apply for Romania, as you know, it was a dictatorship at that time. So they were quite keen to have some people. And I think in that sense, the background that we discussed it in the first question was actually helpful. When I came to the World Bank, then I worked, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I just want to say from the 1990s, I was in the 1990 exactly, I was in the research department working on income inequality and poverty, essentially in Eastern Europe. And the reason was because my dissertation, and that's the important point, my dissertation in Belgrade in 1987 was on income inequality in Yugoslavia, using microdata, which was very unusual in those days. So that was the background, which then led me, of course, to work on Eastern Europe.
So you've talked about, both in blogs and on social media, about your experience in Eastern Europe, working for the World Bank in the 1990s, and it's something I want to come back to in a bit. But also I wanted to pick up a theme which you've mentioned separately, because it's connected to one of our abiding interests on this podcast, which is characterization of the end of history. And so one of the claims that we've made, at least on the podcast, is that era that was characterized by this kind of Fukuyamist liberal complacency over the last 30 years, that era is coming to an end now. And I recall that once on Twitter, you mentioned that a relative living in Belgrade and born in the early 20th century would have lived through so many changes of regime and national citizenship, monarchy, multinational state, the Quisling regime and the war, to communism, to the post-Cold War situation. And you said that no one raised in such a context could imagine that history had ever ended. So I was wondering whether you would characterize the end of history as a kind of a luxury theory that no one outside of the West would kind of meaningfully subscribe to.
I agree with you. I was very doubtful when it actually started, with Fukuyama. By the way, I have to say that his later work, especially the work, the 2-volume book on The Origin of Political Order, I found it actually excellent. But the end of history, I understand the ideological logic. And actually, I think it's very important to distinguish between sort of Hegelian approach and to some extent Marxist approach as well, because Marx also sees the end of history in communism and doesn't see it the way that Fukuyama sees it, but history kind of ends. Although, of course, as you know, in Marx, he says the real history would only start then, when you have a classless society. So I understand that logic, but of course it was simplified, and I think Fukuyama contributed himself to this simplification, where it was seen that essentially we have found an optimal socioeconomic system which would replace all the other systems. So there is no, Chinese history, there is no Islam, there is no Russian history, Euro-Asianism that we now see. There is absolutely nothing. It's only that one system that is now going to rule from now on forever. And I found that very simplistic, as you said, and I was not against it, but I just found that view to be very ahistorical. And I think that we, to some extent, unfortunately, because of the events in Ukraine, which are absolutely awful, but we definitely do see that approach was not valid. And of course, especially also the second reason is that China is certainly not subscribing to this view of the world either.
I would agree with everything that you said there. Moving, I suppose, more now into kind of one of the more substantive claims that you've engaged with. One of the core claims, as I understand it, particularly coming from your most recent book, Capitalism Alone, and where you build on the work of Bill Warren, is your claim that in world historic terms, essentially communism was an engine of economic convergence. That it allowed developing countries to haul themselves into the industrial age and overthrow imperialist oppression. And so I suppose I was wondering, how you give some examples in the book mentioning like Angola, Vietnam, and China. But I was wondering how much that story, if you remove China from that story about communism as an engine of economic convergence, whether or not the thesis still stands, or if it's essentially a kind of a thesis about China more than it is about the role that communism has played historically in the 20th century. So I was wondering if you could maybe just elaborate a bit on that claim in general and how important China is to the thesis as a whole.
Well, Philip, it's a great question. To be maybe flippant, I could say, well, if you eliminated Marx or any sort of even liberal thinkers, the UK, how valid is the story of industrialization? But that's a flippant, answer. But I agree with you. Obviously, China plays a tremendously important role, and China not only plays the tremendously important role because it's a big country. It plays a tremendously important role because, to some extent, my thinking was really patterned after what happened in China. And when I mentioned that the role of communist parties in countries that were colonized was twofold. One was to get rid of political domination that was exercised over them. And secondly, to get rid of the feudal or quasi-feudal institutions. This is like exactly what Mao was saying when he said we have two big mountains to climb. And these are these two mountains. So it is indeed that China played really significant role, both ideologically and in terms of size, and possibly in terms of what it can bring to the world in the future. But I do think that actually the story is not very for Vietnam. Obviously, it's fairly similar, but you can also argue that countries like Algeria, Angola, Ethiopia, although Ethiopia was not really, as you know, colonized except towards the end by Italy. But I would say that actually it does hold, and even India. Now, I mentioned in the book, I say this is not only communist parties, it's also left-wing movements. And India left-wing movement was significant. And had it not been, then going back to the Russian Revolution, had it not been for Lenin's 1920 decision and M.N. Roy in India to basically link the two struggles, we probably would have had a much slower decolonization that we had. So to summarize, I think that you're right to raise the issue of China and whether the story is largely driven by China, which I agree with. But I think there are also other examples. And finally, let me just say that we know that from the empirical work, for example, that was done, that if you look at communist countries, where I now include Yugoslavia as well, and Vietnam and China and Tajikistan and everybody, that the growth rate and the relative success of communism was greater in the less developed parts, which is interesting. Because these were the parts that actually benefited from that kind of a more centralized approach that led to the resource accumulation. Whereas Czech Republic and Slovakia did not really benefit very much.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this point, theory or attempt to understand what the real historic contribution of communism was is an incredibly important one. And since I first encountered that idea, I think in probably some sort of left communist writings, and then you develop it really interestingly in Capitalism Alone, I constantly return back to the idea because I think it's still somehow there's still a knot to be untangled there. And I think you indicate that to a certain extent by saying, well, maybe it is more of a China story. But I think, it would certainly be a contribution that, communist regimes made in Eastern Europe as well, in terms of modernizing those societies. And I wondered what would be the contribution that is being made, or that you see being made, by what you call political capitalism, with, again, China being the sort of quintessential regime, which follows on from keeping some of the state forms of communist regimes, but obviously having a much more private market economy.
Yeah, Alex, this is actually a great question. Let me sort of backtrack a little bit on this global historical role of communism. The story is actually being picked up also in countries like Poland, that also needed to be modernized. And although Poland was not a success case of communism, clearly, and there was a very strong resistance to communism because of its association with the Soviet Union and Russia. But there was certainly an element of significant modernization and breaking of, there were no feudal institutions, but certainly institutions which were retarding economic growth, even in a country like Poland. Now, the general question that I posed, and whether people agree with me or not, it maybe does not even matter. But the general question is, what is the global political or economic role of communism? And we just tend oftentimes to ignore it by basically saying it was some kind of a dead-end street. We don't discuss it. But that's not a very good explanation, because after all, 1/3 of mankind lived for almost 100 years under that system. So we have to have some explanation what brought the system up, what the system did. Even I'm not using the word contribute, but just did. So that's I think, important part. On the political capitalism, this is the term, as you know, that I use, that comes from Max Weber. I could have used also state capitalism. I'm not against that term either. I like political because it seems to me more precise, because it's really the politics that matter. And what could be that we really now go to the sort of systemic debate between the US and China. Of course, the system of political capitalism, again, as exemplified by China, as you say, it's a quintessential example, brings a much greater role of the state, much greater concern on economic growth, and ability to deliver that. And I would like to link, and that's where I'll stop, I was speaking too long, but I would like to link that with the recent review of a book that was on Xi Jinping's sayings. What is interesting in that book is that the emphasis is on governance, is on the delivery of results. The book never mentioned how you become the boss. The book never mentioned how is the process of selection. So unlike in the West, where we actually focus on the process, Xi Jinping in that book talks only about the results. And I think that's actually, to some extent, is the important difference between the two systems.
Oh, that's interesting. I'll have to think on that a little bit more, because I think that's an interesting observation. I did want to take the opportunity, and by the way, feel free to speak at length if you wish as well. I wanted to ask about South America, actually, because and try to fit it into this story about the end of history perhaps never really happening for large parts of the world. And it often feels like, and it's often said that in South America, feels like at least the Cold War never really ended. At least that the assault from the elite on kind of both living standards and the levels of violence and everything make it feel rather like still during the Cold War. And I wonder, maybe even asking counterfactually, what would have been the effect should a maybe left-wing nationalist regimes in large countries in South America actually have held power over a period, whether that would have, in your view, and following this sort of theory, accelerated development to a certain degree to put them in a better situation than they are now. Of course, we know very well why that didn't happen, because most of those regimes were deposed often, with a gun, by the US. So I think, yeah.
I do actually believe that if the left-wing regimes had been more stable and had been able to maintain themselves in power longer, in less developed parts of South America, that would have been actually put those countries in a better position. Now, the counter argument to that is the situation with Cuba that actually, in many respects, replicates the examples of Vietnam or China and so forth. However, geopolitical conditions also have to be taken into account. Cuba is, of course, put under an enormous pressure by its proximity to the United States, and the fact that, of course, there are lots of population of Cuban origin and Cuban citizenship who live in the United States, and that the links have been severed, as you know. When I recently wrote about the sanctions on Russia, and I said they would last for another 50 years, I just had in mind Cuban sanctions that have been now in place for more than 60 years. So there is a geopolitical element, and whether that kind of option was feasible to countries like Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, we have seen in some of them actually left-wing systems being relatively successful, and I have in mind really Bolivia, for example, in this case. For bigger countries and more developed countries like Brazil, that's of course it's a different issue, and whether Brazil obviously had its own dynamic, and so did Argentina and Uruguay. But I think that actually, let me just say that I think that Latin America is not sufficiently discussed in my book, and I agree with that. That there's already some people have made that comment. I had quite a lot of people from Brazil participate in several discussions that they had on capitalism alone, and it was translated in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, very quickly after the publication here. And it is true that actually Latin America is not, maybe because I don't know enough, or it is. Latin America has, I think, a dynamic of its own. So it is not very easy to put that dynamic into this kind of a broader, maybe simplified versions, which I use, where you have China and the United States as the two paragons, and then Latin America somehow gets lost or falls between the cracks.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a bit about your insights and experience of the transition period, in particular in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s, and also to ask how it fits with the broader thesis about the role played by communism. Because I suppose, given the terrible kind of costs of shock therapy, demographic, economic, and the social dislocation, as well as obviously the political upheaval in Yugoslavia, but also in some of the peripheral areas of the former Soviet Union, I wonder how that thesis, if you could, we'd be interested to hear about your kind of personal insights into having been, so kind of closely observing that process, but also how it sits with the thesis, because if the claim is that communism was kind of simply bringing, that the world historic role of communism was to bring these countries up to the level of being integrated into a global capitalist economy, wouldn't we have expected the process to be of that integration to be smoother rather than as dislocating and disruptive as it was?
Yes, I think that this question really can be quite well linked to the previous question about Fukuyama and my view of Fukuyama and the end of history. Again, being from Yugoslavia, which went, as you know, into a civil war, breakup of the countries, genocide, ethnic cleansing, you name it. And not only, I was just struck by the view which regarded these revolutions as revolutions of liberalism and multiculturalism. And what you observe, which was actually even obvious to a blind person, was that the breakup of the countries was according to the ethnic and religious lines, and wherever there was a conflict, it was a conflict driven by a sort of ethnocentric or nationalist ideology. I recently wrote that actually there were 12 overall conflicts in the former Soviet Union and former Yugoslavia. 11 of them were conflicts about borders. The only conflict that was not was a civil war in Tajikistan. So when you see that fact, that actually basically one ethnic group is attacking the other and they're fighting about the border. And you are reading the articles that they say that actually these countries have now become liberal and multicultural. You just say, well, this makes no sense. Yeah. And that's why I actually argue that these revolutions were revolutions of self-determination and nationalism. And when you actually say that these revolutions were revolutions of nationalism, people, of course, react negatively because they have been fed a story of liberalism, which really doesn't fit. And even when you look at countries that have done very well, like Poland and the Baltic countries and the others, what is in the background of their success is really basically nationalism. And that's something that people really have a very hard time accepting, but it is really being shown even in the resistance of East European countries to accept, for example, refugees from the rest of the world. Well, you remember that the European Union was dividing how many refugees from different countries like Syria would be accepted. East European countries all were against that. So how does this fit with the story of liberalism and multiculturalism? It doesn't fit at all. And that was actually my, disagreement from the very start. And it was further exacerbated, obviously, not only by what happened in the former Yugoslavia, but also when I worked for the World Bank, what I saw in Russia in the 1990s, because it was a disaster. But if I come back to Washington and read the press here, the press is like saying, well, things are really phenomenal. And you just go there. I actually didn't travel much to Russia. I was just basically in the big cities like Moscow. And it was a disaster in the 1990s.
So, I mean, just to be a little bit provocative, I guess, or to try to maybe rescue, and not that I want to rescue the end of history thesis, but to try to somehow integrate these. Obviously, they weren't revolutions for multiculturalism or the kind of conception of liberalism, particularly kind of pluralistic liberalism that advocates of, the victorious American empire held. But in a certain regard, the sort of nationalism was the liberalism, but of course of an earlier age, of the mid-19th century, of the early 19th century. And I wonder if that isn't itself perhaps in some way a facet of the sort of, a world of a pensée unique, of liberalism without challengers, that the only recourse you have in pursuit of development or in pursuit of some alternative is precisely the national one, because the kind of socialist dream wasn't there.
I agree with that, actually. And these revolutions are somewhat similar, actually quite similar, to the revolutions of 1848, because you have the democratic element or liberal element, if you want to call it like that, and nationalist element that are combined, fused, and it's difficult to tell which one is more important. In my opinion, for the reasons that I mentioned before, I think that the nationalist element was predominant, especially in countries that felt to have been under some kind of Russian control. So the nationalist element was very strong. But when you have that agreement among the majority of people, are you going to advertise your revolution by saying it be really a revolution in nationalism? Or are you going to advertise it as the Western consultants and Fukuyama and others tell you? That's the revolution of liberalism and democracy. It's very difficult to disentangle the two components, the liberal part and the nationalist part. But there is an incentive always to advertise the liberal or democratic part because it is more general. It appeals to everybody in the world because you're saying that you're obviously in favor of democracy, not simply that you're in favor of relatively constrained ideology, which is by definition nationalism. So I think that there was a tendency to oversell these revolutions as revolutions of democracy / liberalism. And I'm not disputing that, of course, there was not a significant element of that, but it's relatively easy to have the significant element of that when you have a general agreement that you want to be to actually be free from foreign control.
Yeah. And just to pick up on the point about transition, so how does the account of transition, or your understanding of transition, how does that fit with the world, with the claim you make about the world historic role that communism has played as a mechanism of convergence? Because, like I say, if it was convergence, shouldn't the process have been smoother of integrating these countries into the new global market?
Well, Philip, let me just sort of make this precision. The entire argument in chapter 3 of Capitalism Alone is built on the countries that were colonized by, obviously, foreign forces, and that use communism as a way to affect these two revolutions that I spoke about before. So they actually do not fit East European case. And that's why if you look at the book, I actually think that the greatest world historical event in the 20th century was not the Russian Revolution, was actually the Chinese Revolution. And you really have very few mentions, except that actually I think that 1920 Congress that I mentioned before was quite important in the Russian revolutions. But ironically, in my interpretation of history, the Russian Revolution was important because it enabled the rise of China. I mean, to simplify the story. So to go back to your, go ahead. Yeah, I won't forget go ahead.
Well, I mean, so it's useful to have that clarification. I suppose it's this that concerns me, I suppose, from the viewpoint of, while I like and I agree in broad measure with the claim about the world historic role that communism has played in terms of economic convergence, it does leave me uneasy that the Russian Revolution, given its kind of, its significance to, the USSR in the Cold War, the USSR in the Second World War, the history of Eastern Europe, not to mention, I suppose, even now the war in Ukraine is a legacy of that time. I'm left feeling uneasy that, as you've just mentioned now, that it's kind of compressed to such a less significant role. And it leaves me feeling that there's a missing element to the story, I suppose.
It's a really good question. Let me try to think. Of course, I simplified a little bit too much by saying that, of course, the key role was to propel China to a global historical position that it has now. But Philip, actually, can you imagine? Let's suppose that China becomes really at least as powerful as the United States, and maybe even more in the next 50 years or so. Wouldn't then really, and if you really accept that argument that they just made, wouldn't then really that be the story that somebody in 50 or 70 years from now would actually take from all this period? It could be, because that was really transformative. If you look at East European countries, as I was saying before, we know that actually from empirical work that actually less developed countries benefited more from communism, and actually more developed countries had a negative effect of communism. So we all take that, and I think we generally agree, because this is what the numbers give us. But in the global scheme of things, in 70 years from now, really it would not matter that much. These are small countries. It really doesn't matter to what happened to Eastern Europe, and what will matter to the world is what happened to China. But I do agree with you that there is a little bit of a lack of full maybe recognition or maybe even inclusion in the story of the role of the Russian Revolution, which I do agree with you was absolutely, it was a crucial development in the history of the world. It's just, I don't see that Russia was, how should I say, of such importance globally that China now has and potentially would have.
No, I think I get that. I guess that's where you end up if you try to resolve what you call the Marxists' 1989 problem, which is, I guess, analogous to what you see as the liberals' 1914 problem. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about this conception and how you went about trying to resolve that 1914 problem and that 1989 problem. Because I think it's a cute way to put it, but it might be a bit opaque for someone who hasn't read the book.
Yeah, and it may be somewhat of a simplification. 1914 problem, I really like the question about 1914 problem, because I think it's really a very important problem that is relevant for us today. And I'll explain why it is relevant for us today. 1914 problem is basically the following. You have globalization, which actually starts from 1868 and 70, and that globalization gradually, as we all know, includes greater and greater part of the world. There is developments even in India. There is now even sort of a story of developments in China, but obviously Europe, Russia actually develops quite well with very high rate of growth. And also there is greater democratization. If you look at all of most participants in World War I, they were democracies or quasi-democracies. US, UK, France, Germany, which had a parliament which was elected. The parliament did not have the power that normal parliaments do, but it was an elected parliament with freedom of the press and so forth. Austria, Hungary, Serbia, they were all democracies. And then you have the following problem. You have globalization, interdependence of trade, and democratization. And what is the result? The greatest war in history up to that point ever. So it is a problem. And you say, well, we would expect convergence. We would expect, as Norman Angell and actually Ivan Bloch before him talked about interdependence, which makes the wars, impossible, meaning actually too costly, so they would not be undertaken. And we do have a war. And why is it a problem? Because liberal theology, or teleology rather, cannot really solve that problem because it should not have happened. And it is relevant for us today because we have exactly the same processes now. I will not repeat globalization and democratization as well. And we may end up in a nuclear war. So then you ask yourself a question, why is that logic, which seems really impeccable, of interdependence, economic convergence, and peace as a necessary tool to achieve that, why it doesn't work? So that's 1914 problem. And I think actually Lenin's and actually Hobson's approach before, and then Lenin's and Rosa Luxemburg's makes lots of sense because essentially they said this is a competition between two different capitalisms, and you can apply it to today as well. It's a competition between Chinese capitalism and the American capitalism. And then the story fits extremely well. 1989 problem, however, is different because their Marxist story really has a problem that countries that were ostensibly socialist now go back to capitalism. And so for Marxist thinking, it is really difficult to explain that because it is the same as I was saying that in the book. I was saying it's like feudalism suddenly, actually, capitalist countries like, let's suppose, France, suddenly decided to reintroduce the le premier état, le deuxième état, and le tiers état after the revolution. It's just sort of unthinkable. Yeah. So these are the two problems. But I think for us today, the 1914 problem is really of crucial importance.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that the third worldists were right, but for the wrong reasons, ultimately. I mean, to refer back to the point about the historic contribution of communism, that revolution would be, that could take place in the third world, but that it was only to see through capitalism.
I wanted to talk more directly about the data on inequality that some of which you've already mentioned, Branko, with respect to the different role that communism played in different countries and how it was regressive in countries that were more developed, such as the Czech Republic and Hungary, and progressive in the more rural and backward countries. So one of the other tropes you've pursued is tracking how inequality between nations changes alongside inequality within nations and how these two things interact. So I was just wondering if you could... and there's some the debates about the so-called elephant chart and so on. I was just wondering if you could summarize, what the data tells us at this particular point in time, and with respect to where we are with inequality in the global order.
Phil, let me go a little bit like following actually the logic of your question. Go back in history, and we have actually done quite a lot of historical excursion anyway so far. So let's continue. If you look at global inequality, and we have reasonably good data on the GDP per capita from 1800s, and we have kind of guesses. I think there will be in the future really greater improvements in those type of data, but we do have guesses or estimates of inequality in large countries from the 19th century. The important part is the following. If you track inequality from 1820, what you notice, 19th century, all the way to World War I, is characterized by increasing global inequality, which is driven by two forces. First, countries become countries diverge because China and India do not grow, and Western Europe and the US and later Japan really become rich. So the gaps become very large and they involve lots of people. And you have an increase in between country inequality. Very important point. But secondly, there is an increase in within national inequalities. So you can call that period of a whole century, you can call it a period of basically imperialism, because that was really externally how it was manifested, and increased class struggle within the countries. Then you come to the period which is difficult to actually formalize because it's very short. That's the period between the two wars. But then gradually what you do have a continuation of high inequality and a very high plateau. And that's the world of the three worlds in which I was born. When there was the first world, the second world, the third world, very clear differences in average incomes between all three of them, and moderation in domestic inequalities. In socialist countries, inequality went down. And of course, in capitalist countries, it went down as well. In the UK, in France, in the Netherlands, in the US, actually, Kuznets was so impressed with the decline in US inequality between 1930s, when he got the first data, to 1950, that actually they argued at this speed, US inequality would be reduced almost to zero. Of course, zero is impossible, but the speed of the reduction was really enormous. There is a sentence from Kuznets where he says, well, like in 10 years, we will almost have no inequality. Okay, and that period ends by late 1980s, 1990. And there you have the third period, and we are now living that third period, where thanks to increase in income in China and India, we have a convergence in incomes between people and the creation of something that you might call middle class. At the same time, within national inequalities increase. So you notice that actually each period has its own specific features, which are both international and within national. And this is what the current period is. It's really driven by the rise of Asia in terms of mean incomes and thereby convergence in incomes on average. But on the other hand, within country inequalities have increased.
Phil, did you want to go on?
Well, it was only to pick up this question about how far China can serve as a model. And we've touched upon it in terms of political capitalism. So, and it's something we've disagreed about on this podcast, and that our listeners also have taken issue with us over. And this question of how far China can serve as a model for development, for economic convergence, and I suppose also for reducing inequality elsewhere. And the reason I mention it is because I was so I'm interested to hear your view, but the reason I mention it is because I was very struck by those images, some of the really terrible images that came out of the US withdrawal from Kabul, where you had people clinging onto the undercarriages of the B-52s that were going into the air and falling out of the sky. And it seemed to me like, I can't imagine a world in which it's ever conceivable that you would have similar that people would cling to risk their lives clinging to the undercarriages of bombers that were leaving your country in order to get into China. So that however impressive its economic transformation has been internally, that simply its political system, its cultural kind of hegemony at the global level, its openness, or its closeness as a society, means it will never be able to rival the US in terms of the appeal as an overall kind of package for the world.
True, and actually, I mentioned that China has a problem. There is a whole section there about selling the Chinese model. China has a double problem. The first problem that historically China was really never selling its model, so it was the seller was not there. They were, as you know, historically they were very happy to have to have a tributary kingdoms around them, and basically, as you know, these kingdoms would essentially acquire the Chinese sort of overlordship, but there would be nothing essentially that they would have to do except to visit China, give presents, and trade. So China was not selling very much and continued not selling very much its model, neither under Maoist, history nor present. Well, then recently it actually had to start partly, I think, because it feels under the pressure, obviously, of the American model, which is much more universal, because the values of democracy, freedom to do what you want in terms of economic activities are universal. So they are not really specific to a given civilization. So China, I think, had to start trying to see how to package its own results and its own success. But secondly, the buyers are not also like many simply because of the problems of somewhat cultural, I would call it cultural aloofness. I think actually had one piece which was based on a book by Martin Schack that I called it the Aloofness of Sinica. Simply, they took their position in the past as given, and they were really not either developing the model very much or selling it, as I was saying before, and they were not sufficiently universal. That could be changing now, especially when we see Chinese influence in Africa. That is, of course, more important economically. And also, I think that actually other countries, without discussing now Chinese civilization, they can take from China the importance of economic growth and delivery of improvement in prosperity and sort of de-emphasized part on democracy. So, that part is not unattractive. And I really don't want to mention here the names because people immediately sort of jump and say, like Orban, for example. You can actually see certain elements, and even in Erdogan. People don't actually know that income inequality, for example, in Turkey until the recent period. The recent period is very different. But Turkey had 15 years of fairly strong growth and the creation of a strong middle class. Yeah. And there are certain elements that you can say that Erdogan as well took from the Chinese experience. So you don't become Chinese by doing that, but you actually refocus the attention to economic growth and defocus the attention on democracy.
Yeah, I think that especially the way Phil framed the question gave off what the divergence was between us on this question. And I mean, I was potentially envisaging that China could represent a sort of model or some sort of ideal, precisely because of another sort of convergence, a socio-political one, and one which is converging, I guess, downward in terms of the freedoms available, especially in the West. And I think if, and as you recognize, the US increasingly oligarchical, and the degree of collective control offered to the ordinary citizen is diminishing. And even at the level of kind of more individual freedoms also diminished, that, given these kind of increasingly similar choices in terms of the amount of freedoms available, in terms of the amount of democracy, that then China's fast growth comes to represent something, it's not exactly the shining city on a hill, but the better of the two alternatives. And I guess that's how I would see that scenario perhaps playing out. But I wonder if you still would disagree with that vision.
No, I would agree. I mean, let me put it in a most general way. My argument in the book, and generally I think I've used it several times, was that for many people, there is a trade-off between rights or democratic rights and economic improvement. If you look at Rawls has a sort of, a lexicographical ordering of liberties. And you have, the first point is that actually there is no trade-off between political rights and economic growth. Actually, he says that explicitly. There is no trade-off. So we start with political rights and democracy. Then the next point is, I think the difference principle comes as number 3 point, but there is no trade-off. I think that actually for many people, there is a trade-off. And the trade-off then means that at some point, you might actually sacrifice some of democratic freedoms for greater income. That's what I want to put in the most general sense. So you're not really now discussing the US, you're not discussing China, you're just saying whether that trade-off does exist or not. And I agree with what Phil's argument was. And actually, we have to remember that the same thing happened in Saigon in 1975. So it's not only in Kabul. We have seen it before. And I talked about Cuba as well. But it's also true that if you take the situations now of the three countries, including Afghanistan, but I would also take Libya and Iraq, the so-called introduction of democracy there led to a total, Libya is in a total civil war. Actually, if you read the newspaper like 2 days ago, on the same day, we had an attack in the green zone in Iraq with 12 people who died and significant clashes in Tripoli. So you have two counter-examples there. That there was an issue of the trade-off. Okay, let's push democratic sort of accountability to the forefront. What you end up with essentially breaking the countries and ending up in civil strife or ethnic conflict, or as you know, Libya is divided into two parts of the country that are basically at war with each other. So in the most general sense, let me just sort of repeat that. I think that we have to acknowledge the existence of the trade-off. If we do acknowledge them, then we decide where on that trade-off we wish to be.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think part of that, the question of that trade-off, depends also on the degree to which people seek self-rule, the extent to which people are willing to take the public stage, or whether they're content to see their private desires catered to through growth.
Alex, may I just say here, that goes back to your previous point. If you have so-called democratic systems where increasingly, and I think that's the case, taking public stage becomes more costly in terms of your time, and the results of taking public stage are really irrelevant because the public stage is controlled by people who have money, then you really look at a situation where actually that kind of activity is generally meaningless or of very small importance. And on the other hand, you can say what I really care is whether my children can go to school, whether I would have a job, whether my streets would be clean, and whether it would be safe for me to go out. And that's where the trade-off comes. And that's what I was saying. Actually, we have to acknowledge that for many people, these 4 or 5 things that I mentioned, including school and streets and safety and all of that, are important. We cannot just say they're not important, and they would rather have people shoot them in the street and have a say in local politics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So I did want to ask, because you were mentioning a second ago about Africa and China's role there, and the extent to which China might provide a model. Do you think that we've in some way reached the end of modernization, which is rather a big question, or is there still another sort of twist in the tail? And I mean this in the sense that, the job, especially as you've described the role that communist parties have done in modernizing backwards countries. Most countries around the world are more or less complete in terms of transitioning into modern market economies, however unequal, still backward in certain regards, corrupt and so on, that they are. So is there still sort of more gas in the engine of modernization?
Well, Alex, that's, a very difficult question. I would actually try to skip it or to avoid it. I'm a big fan of modernization, and I think we will. There are many parts of the world that need to be quote unquote modernized, because modernization I take essentially to mean increased income and easier way to fulfill all our material desires. There's of course a conflict, and you might remember for chapter 5 of Capitalism alone, the conflict between our ability to fulfill these material desires and the need to accept certain sort of value system that then de-emphasizes or makes redundant or actually makes us forget other elements that are also very important, like family. I mentioned that before, or a life which is less driven by monetary satisfaction or monetary gain. But I would take modernization really to be essentially defined in economic terms. And if you define it like that, there is still a long way to go, because if you look at let me just say one number that I think many people find striking. in the West, of course, we are used to actually sort of seeing the middle class here as something normal. But the person with the middle class income of Western countries is at 91st global percentile. So that person that we think is like normal income that, we can see that everybody should have is richer than 91% of the people in the world. And when you see that, then you can say, wow, there is a lot of scope for other 91% of people to come to that position that we find reasonable. Because that's what our experience tells us. But when you put that experience in numbers, when you look at the world is a pretty poor place.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I guess I'm fairly, unfortunately, not very optimistic about the possibilities of that, even though I think it's very desirable. And I wanted to ask earlier, actually, so I might as well take the opportunity now. What kind of possibilities do you think are open, looking at the kind of contemporary conjuncture for development in the poorer countries and middle income countries for that matter as well?
As you said, I'm actually quite in favor of economic growth. And you probably know that I had debates there with people for degrowers. I'm not going to repeat them all now, but I believe that economic growth is absolutely indispensable for the improvement in not only way of life of people, but actually allowing people opportunities to basically self-realize. Without economic growth and without income and without wealth, you really cannot self-realize because you're so much constrained in your daily activity. You just it's practically survival. From day to day, you have to fight to survive. And what income gives us is a possibility to go a little bit beyond that and really realize our human potential. So that's where I'm in disagreement with people who believe that we should not grow, because I think that basically they take their own experience. They see that actually there are bad things about growth. I don't deny that. I was talking about the acceptance of the system of values, which I think is not ideal at all. And I'm talking also about climate change and many other issues. But I still believe that, again, like in a trade-off, we are actually still, for most of the world, in the situation where economic growth is of primary importance. And one more point on that, because we talked about China before. I see China's role in Africa not only being positive directly, because you can question that, whether all the projects really made sense or not. Probably some of them did not make sense. But the fact that China got involved in Africa has led, as you know, more recently Biden and the US to also start proposing fairly similar programs for Africa. So if you're an African country, this is good for you. You're going to play off China against the US and you will get more money. It would go faster. So I think in that sense, the competition of the two superpowers is good for the countries that actually can play one superpower against the other.
Hey there, this is the end of the free episode. If you've enjoyed it, make sure you follow the podcast, and we're also on social media everywhere. You'll find us by searching BungaCast. And also, drop us a review. We would be greatly appreciative if you would. In the second part of this episode, we continue our chat with Branko Milanovic. We discuss how inflation is likely to impact inequality, and ask Branko what he means by the paleo left as an ideological position, and why we should adopt this perspective. And we also look forward to Branko's new book on the history of studies on inequality, and find out why Marx and libertarians have more in common than we often might think. That's for subscribers only at patreon.com/bungacast. We'd be delighted if you join us over there. For $5 a month, you get access to this, as well as 2 original exclusive episodes a month. See you there.